Good afternoon, Adrian. What a pleasure it is to see you here. I know that you've been one of the most exceptionally busy people in the Australian art world. So I'm really delighted that you've put some time aside to speak to the Artists' Well, which is broadcast out of Ireland. So it's a very special broadcast, but it's very special for us to be able to bring some of the images that you're so familiar with to audiences who may be not quite as familiar with them as you are. But I'd just like to start off by saying, look, you've been involved in the Indigenous Aboriginal art world for the last 40 years. How did this all start?
As most fortunate ventures do start through personal relationships, and my particular interest in first in ecology, then in the third world, and discovering the third world on our footsteps here in Australia, and but also simultaneously, from an art point of view, discovering Australian Aboriginal bark paintings, which fitted seemed so apt at the time when I was. I'd done agricultural science. I'd specialized in ecology. I was interested in deep ecology. And here was an art form. And I came from an art background. My parents were artists and performers in the theatre. And so, here was a piece of art that was totally indigenous to the place that it came from. The ochres that were used were the crushed earth from the ground of the art where the artist lived. The bark was from the trees where the artist lived. The brushes were made from his own human hair and from the grasses that grew around him. And even the fixative at that time was orchid juice that was taken from the swamplands in Australia's tropical far north. And it just completely mesmerized me, I guess. I mean, Aboriginal art has changed a great deal since those days, when bark painting was considered to be the epitome of Aboriginal fine art. But uh, and today, it's been embraced as a form of contemporary abstraction, or by people that aren't even interested in it from an ethnographic point of view. But nevertheless, that's how I got started.
But was it considered as an ethnographic art form as opposed to a contemporary art form at the time? I know there was a lot of interest from overseas in ethnographic artworks. Were our Aboriginal artists sort of put into that category?
Yeah, well, certainly when I got first involved in the late 70s, early 80s, 1980s, the total Aboriginal art market was worth less than $2 million a year. Today, it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So the people that were buying Aboriginal art at that time, when I first began, were basically ethnophiles, people interested in from the point of view of tribal society, I guess, and the same sort of people that were interested in ethnographic art. From Oceania, Africa, and New Guinea, but Aboriginal art had already begun to embrace contemporary modern materials 10 years earlier, when well, the dominant myth is that it was Jeff Barden's stint at Papunya as a school teacher in the beginning of the 1970s that gave rise to this pointless dog movement or sand painting movement, as they call it.
Hmm.
But actually, there were people that had worked with anthropologists that had done this sort of art a decade or two earlier. But nevertheless, this certainly gave the impetus to the use of modern materials and acrylic paint and canvas, linen, and that kind of propelled a culture in which there was never such a thing as a rectangular artifact
Hmm.
like a painting
But
into the
you
contemporary art world.
you pretty well started off with bark paintings, and who were your main collectors? Were they Australians, local people, or universities? Who were your main collectors then?
No, they weren't Australians, although there were Australian clients, of course. But the whole impetus for the bark painting movement really began in the end of the 1940s,
Oh.
so quite considerably earlier, when during what was known as the Australian American Scientific Expedition, organised between Australian institutions and the Smithsonian in America. And scientists from 18 different disciplines spent a year across Australia's far north collecting natural history items and Aboriginal artifacts and barks. And this gave rise to a desire. I mean, you have to remember that a decade earlier than that, the first seat of anthropology was established in Australia at Sydney University, the early 1930s. And so the uh, missionaries
Hmm.
sending Aboriginal artifacts and barks down to the nascent institutions, museums in Australia to be studied by these anthropologists that were emerging out of the universities. And this slowly gave rise to more and more bark paintings, but in a slow, measured way until the 1948 expedition, when a large number of barks were produced, and Aboriginal people in the Arnhem Land started to realize that actually white fellas who had never taken any interest in them in their lives were suddenly interested in their culture and the things that they produced. So they started to produce more. And through the 60s and 70s, a growing field of collecting endeavour grew around that. There was sending bark paintings to European and American tribal art galleries.
Hmm.
Um, and so the first exhibition of bark paintings ever held in Australia was 1959, and by the Burnts, and then um, so the by the 80s, to answer your question, the vast majority of collectors were Americans and Europeans, Germans, Italians, French, and British that would come to Australia and either want something unique because it was a proto-Aboriginal art industry, and a lot of these barks were sold through the Church Aid Society and other philanthropic organisations and church societies. But slowly, galleries and tribal dealers started to emerge, and the market sort of started to grow. So you remember I said that it was worth 2 million in 1980. It was worth less than 1 million in 1970, 10 years earlier, and then it started to grow exponentially through the 1980s until about 1988. There was a study done by the government that estimated that the industry was worth 18 million. And by 1995, another study said 45 million. And then we had the Sydney Olympics, and it just kept growing and growing and growing.
So, when did the actual sort of change occur? Was it when people were introduced, when Indigenous people in remote areas were introduced to canvas and paint? Was that the big changing point?
Yes, so what happened was in 1970, when the Whitlam government came to power, a number of important uh, um, uh, incidences happened at the same time. Um, the Australia Council for the Arts was started, and one of the initial boards was the Aboriginal Arts Board of the Australia Council. The Aboriginal bureaucracy started a company called, it had various names over the years, Aboriginal Arts Australia, Aboriginal Arts and Crafts. And it was started by the Aboriginal Development Commission, which was set up by the government to try to stimulate economic opportunities in remote communities. And
Mhm.
so this company eventually, by the end of the 70s, had galleries in every capital city around Australia. And then later, and this coincided with what was called the Homelands Movement or the Pintabee Exodus, where after several decades during which um, patrol officers depopulated the centre of Australia by encouraging nomadic Aborigines to come into service centres and towns and missions, where they could get their children could get an education, and there were various other advantages. Through the 60s, there'd been a terrible drought throughout the desert regions, and Aboriginal people were starving. Now, when moved into Aboriginal communities, they could get food and welfare, and there were clinics and health facilities. So this all happened during the 60s, but during the 80s, when Whitlam came to power, the Labor government decided that this had caused far more deleterious consequences than beneficial ones to Aboriginal people, because now Aboriginal people were prey to drugs and alcohol, and their culture was being dissipated, their languages lost, and everything. So, in order to reverse this trend, there were certain people within the government that said that they should establish outstations and townships back out into the country so that Aboriginal people could once more live next to their land. They were also very depressed about the fact that they'd been separated from their country, which was everything to them. And so from this point on, um, uh, Aboriginal art centres started to be established throughout the remote regions and townships of Aboriginal Australia. By the time I got involved in the industry in 1980, there were about 10 of them. There are now today over 150 Aboriginal art centres in remote communities that service Aboriginal people that want to engage in the arts. And so through the 80s, it was growing slowly, as I said. But then several things happened at the end of the 80s, which proved to be very, very important. And one was that Sotheby's started to do standalone sales of Aboriginal art.
Mhm.
Um, and instead of selling paintings as if they were generic, they started naming the artists, and there was a lot more knowledge around about the most important artists. In fact, one artist, Rover Thomas, was selected to be our representative at the Venice Biennale in 1990, along with an urban Aboriginal artist, Trevor Nichols. And so when Sotheby's decided to do their first Aboriginal fine art sale, this also coincided with the fact that interest rates in Australia had ballooned to over 20%. So, and a lot of galleries were doing it very tough. So the non-Indigenous, non-specialist, non-ethnographic galleries, the contemporary mainstream galleries started to say, well, hang on a second, if it's good enough for Sotheby's, And all those Aboriginal galleries seem to be doing better than we are. Why don't we just take the best artists and promote them according to the white representational model, which is what they started to do. And from that point on, basically, you could characterize the industry as an internecine war ground in which the battle for the best artists has been the ongoing characteristic of the market for the last 30 years and has led to a situation now where the elitists, like Sotheby's and their followers and the elite exhibiting galleries, do whatever they can to denigrate the specialist galleries and shops that work with artists, um, by saying that their provenance is less desirable than that of the elite galleries.
But doesn't that come back to it's an old out of date phrase which people don't use that often, but connoisseurship?
Well, of course, I mean, but trying to convince people when you've got institutions um, that quite rightly um, are engaged in a process of giving Indigenous people agency over the way in which their art is exhibited and interpreted, um, then you have, and we're in a situation where more and more and more young Aboriginal people are going to art schools and graduating with Masters of Fine Arts in museum studies and gallery management and the rest. It is a natural consequence that these graduates need jobs. And where else are they going to be employed but in many of them, but other than institutions, state and national galleries, and etc. And when these people get their jobs in these institutions, and then the institutions turn around and say, um, well, we are very concerned about the provenance of the things that we collect in our institution. And because we're so concerned, we defer to the wishes and the recommendations of Indigenous people who work within our organisation. That's quite understandable. However, these people that are occupying those positions do not have any connoisseurship whatsoever. They weren't there. They weren't working in the field. They didn't know the artists. They didn't watch the artists paint. They don't know the difference between, a good and a bad painting or the circumstances under which it was painted. They're making subjective judgments based on a level of, obviously, well, to a certain extent, a level of ignorance. And those people that were around during the history of the movement, those people that were out working in the field, or working with the artists during the 1970s and 80s, who have hold the corporate memory of the industry, um, and who are the most capable of exercising connoisseurship, are characterized for the most part as being self-interested, egregious commercial operators that are not part of the bureaucratic archipelago, and therefore are less are likely to be unsavory or have skeletons in the closet or whatever.
I wanted to pick up on something that you said a little bit earlier, just about the difference between remote artists that work in remote districts, and urban Aboriginal artists. Can you explain what the difference is?
Well, they're so you have Aboriginal people that every Aboriginal person identifies according to their clan, their tribe, or whatever. The first thing you'll hear or see on any Aboriginal person's resume is that they're a proud Gamilaroi or Warlpiri person, etc. Everybody, you have to recognize the fact that there were something of the order of 250 different tribal groups in Australia. Don't quote me on that, but there are a
Mhm.
lot of different tribal groups, a lot of different Aboriginal languages, at least that many Aboriginal languages before white people came here. And of course, the people that were most impacted by the arrival of Europeans in Australia were those on the land that was the most valuable to the Europeans, which they took, as if there were no custodians, terra nullius. They took the land and they exploited it, and they paid little or no compensation. Quite the opposite. They murdered Aboriginal people, and by the way. It was not with the acquiescence or the support of the British government. The British government did whatever they could to insist that the various governors of Australia in the early days were kindly disposed towards Aboriginal people, but the settlers, in their greed and avarice to take more and more land and push their cattle and their sheep further and further and further into Aboriginal land, murdered with impunity. And it was in it, according to the law in Australia, no Aboriginal witness to a massacre could testify in a court of law that they'd seen such a thing. So, this is part of the colonialisation process, and the dispossession of Aboriginal people. So I'm answering your question in a very discursive way, Nick.
You
But the truth is that you have a lot of Aboriginal people that grew up in and amongst the contemporary mainstream, or either on the wrong side of the tracks, or were assimilated into the mainstream, and some of them. Then you have other people um, who were, for instance, living on their tribal land, but the administrators on that tribal land, for one reason or another, characterized them as troublemakers, would send them out of that area and send them to missions or in on the eastern seaboard. They might have sexual relations and a family with another Aboriginal person from another community that was a completely different culture, and have mixed Aboriginal children. And then if they made trouble there, they might have been moved on to another community where they had children by another person. So a lot of the urban Aboriginal people their heritage is a mixture of several different Aboriginal heritages, and and as well and European heritage, because Aboriginal women and men had families with non-Aboriginal men and women. And so all of these people are what you might call urban Aboriginals or transitional Aboriginals. And when they make art, they either have to go back to the tribal symbols
Mhm.
that were particular to their tribe or tribes, and invent or their own art, um, or be function like a contemporary artist and interpret their politics, dreams, and other issues that are important to them. But
So how did those
a tribal artist cannot borrow on the art style of a tribe
ah,
that is not their own.
yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at, that those signs and symbols that are specific to each to each group. I mean, they are earned, and they're sort of given by right,
Correct.
as
That,
far as I know.
that's
But
correct. If you're
but
a member of the Warlpiri tribe and you are a Warlpiri artist, there are you have your own language, you have your own artistic, stylistic conventions that that are derived from body painting for ceremony, low relief ground sculptures for ceremonial grounds. If you're from Arnhem Land, they might be derived from rock art
Mhm.
or the images that were painted on bark shelters, and body art for ceremonies again. And these must these are you earn the right by going through various levels of initiation during your graduation into adulthood to use those symbols, and it causes enormous offence to traditional people when other people, non-Warlpiri or Guningu people, use symbols and imagery that isn't appropriate,
But
and it also makes it very easy to tell a fake Aboriginal painting because when you're looking at Aboriginal paintings, somebody with connoisseurship can tell immediately if the symbols that are used in a painting are inappropriately placed together.
But with the urban Aboriginals, they seem to be a lot more realistic. They paint in more of a Western style, and they seem to be a lot more political than the artists from the remote districts.
Well, that's true and not true. I mean, there are a lot of urban Aboriginal artists that are figurative artists and are doing narrative figurative painting. But there are also a lot of urban Aboriginal artists that use symbols and a kind of form of abstraction that that is what you might when you look at it, you think it's more decorative, it's less figurative, it's more um, I don't know, less narrative. You can't read the story in it, but it has a deep
Hmm.
story. It has meaning. Even an urban Aboriginal person that has had any school, any instruction will want to portray um, various aspects of their totemic or tribal affiliations, even if it's, say, a water dreaming and it looks
Hmm.
like an abstract image of that pertains to water. Or that's
Yeah.
that's their dreaming.
But that is a deep connection, isn't it? That goes right back from the city to the remote districts.
Yeah, it's what makes Aboriginal
Yeah.
art so fascinating.
So let's, I mean, we could talk forever about that, but let's talk a little bit about the book that you produced. And I'm going to hold that up so that people can see. Which way do I go? This way. Um, this was a bit of a new venture for you, wasn't it? Was this did this come before COVID, or did it come before the GFC? Or what prompted you to read this, and where did you get the title?
Well, my wife gave me the title.
Oh, really?
But it kind of feeds into the zeitgeist, doesn't it? Everybody thinks the deal is the one that makes all the money. So, I thought, oh, well, if you're going to write a book, even if it's like a history of the Aboriginal art movement, who's going to buy it? The number of people interested. If you put a book called Aboriginal Art on the shelf, not that many. But if you if you give it a provocative title, maybe more people will buy it. And if they do, and they read the first chapter and get into it, well, you've got halfway there. The book took 6 years to complete. I only took a year to write, but
Yeah.
you know, the biggest part of writing I've found is rewriting and polishing every sentence and checking every fact and making it into a discursive and enjoyable read that isn't so burdened with facts and names and figures that it destroys the narrative.
No,
So
it's very
40
true. Yeah.
there's 40 pages of sort of 6 point uh, footnotes in
Yes,
the back of the book, and
I
that's
noticed.
stuff I took out to make the book itself read so much more pleasantly.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
it's all
yes.
backed up with facts and references and God knows what else. There's a huge bibliography as well. What I'd say about that is, well, look, I've had the most extraordinary life in Aboriginal art, in art in general. You know, I started off, as I told you, interested in ecology and coming from an art background. I opened a shop. It was I wanted it to be unique and Australian. I had a little bit of Aboriginal art in it when I first opened, but suddenly the doors opened. I met more Aboriginal people. I was encouraged by Aboriginal bureaucrats and others who were very, very influential to get more involved at a time when there were very few people involved. And my gallery ended up being the oldest Aboriginal art gallery in the country.
Mhm.
I sold it 3 years ago, but that's another story.
That is. But
In the
the
process,
yeah.
sorry, I just say, in the process, I got more and more and more involved in Aboriginal art and became an industry commentator and all sorts of things. And then I started the Aboriginal Art Association of Australia, which is the ethical body that art dealers and artists and art centres belong to, which has a code of ethics and business practice in order to become I develop a corporate entity for the industry, if you like.
Hmm.
And then around about just after the Olympics in Sydney, the owner of the biggest Australian-owned art auction house approached me and said, "Would you do an auction for me?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll give it a go." So, so he gave me $1 million budget, or at least he said, "I want you to sell $1 million worth of art," and I sold 1.8 million. And he signed me to three more auctions, and then signed me to another three. And before I knew it, some things happened within the company and I ended up being the managing director of the entire company. So this is a this is a company turning over $100 million worth of art a year at the time of Australian contemporary, international, and Aboriginal art. So and then he came back one day from New York with a major Picasso and a few other important paintings that he wanted to put into his sales. And he said to me, Adrian, the mother of all economic tsunamis is coming. This was 2007, 8. And I want you to batten down the hatches. He said, I want you to fire 20 people. I want you to do this. And anyway, what with one thing and another, I said to him, uh, well, look, it's your business. You have every right to do that. But from my point of view, I think I've done enough in this field. I want to go back to doing my own thing and being an art consultant. So I went back and I resurrected my business, which had been bubbling along with my staff outside of my I kept a fatherly eye on it. So I built that up again. But while I was when he fired me, I went up to my country property and wrote that book.
Oh.
Took me a
So
year to write.
at what point did you, we've been looking at some images on the screen here. There's obviously a website attached to that. Is that, where did the website come from. And I think that there's one section of it that has a series of artist profiles, which I'm sure that international audiences would like to have a look at. Can we talk about that?
Oh, sure. So when I wanted to write the book, I sat down and I wrote 1,000,000 words in a year. Took it to a publisher, a Main Street publisher. The publisher said, "Well, actually, this is three projects. It's not a book. There's a book in there which we're interested in, which became the book that you showed people. But there's the profiles and market analytics and all sorts of information on the top 200 artists of all times, and that's really an almanac. That's better suited to the online. And
Hmm.
then there's another book on how to buy and sell art and how to make sense of the art market and what makes Aboriginal art different to other sorts of art. And that became a blog, and which I published sequentially, but is also now going to be available on this website. So as you can see, if you can see, here are all the artists, and they're all ranked. So Kathleen Pachari is, according to my ranking. I worked with a prominent art economist to develop a formula to rank these artists according to the secondary market performance indicators of their work. So if you take Kathleen Pachari, for instance, here, and I open her up, here is Kathleen. Here is a biography. It's not really a conventional profile. It's where she came from, how she worked, who she worked with, how her works found their way into the market, which works are considered to have better provenance than others because of the people she worked with, or the materials she used, or whether the paintings are better or not. It's got its references, if I use references. But you'll also see across the top here, besides the profile, there's a market analysis that tells you how her artworks have performed in the market over the years.
Can we have a look at that?
Oh, well, yes. Well, I've opened it up there, and I'd say,
Is there a
um,
graph that goes with that?
yes, there is. Uh, so let me see now. Market performance. This is a
Ah,
graph. So this graph gives her market performance, or her rating, as her annual AAMI rating, which is the Australian Aboriginal, or the Aboriginal Art Market Index, which I can explain. How is it calculated? Well, here is calculated. The rating is their success rate at auction. That is the total number of sales in millions times their clearance rate, though 70% of the work sold, for instance. That's a calculation, their success rate, plus their profligacy index, which is the number of works offered divided by 100, plus their unit value, which is their average price divided by 10,000. And when that's those three indices are added together, it gives their rating. And you can see here that Kathleen Pachari's rating has increased. Or sorry, well, this is how the orange line.
hmm.
Uh, Hang on, let's see now. So the orange line is her rating each year. And the blue line, oh, there you are. There's her rating each year. Annual rating, 1.6 in 2005, a little less the next year, 1.3 in 2010. When all of these are cumulatively added, hang on, there you go. So they accumulate each year. So you'd expect it to be going up, of course, because, right now in 2024 or whatever, all of those annual ratings have accumulated to a rating of nearly 17. 16.89. Whereas if you and just before I go back, if you look at the top 10 artworks sold at auction, so you can see here that the highest price ever paid for a work by Kathleen Pachari was achieved at was achieved in 2009,
Hmm.
and it was $96,000. Second highest price was $73,000, then 47, 43, 42, 41,
Mm.
40, etc., down to the 10th highest price is 28,000. Um, uh, so if I go back to
So is
uh,
this just for your own reference, or is this accessible by anyone who?
this is absolutely free. Anybody can log on to my website and download this information free of charge.
Oh,
Let's take Lynn Onus, who is the third most successful Aboriginal artist of all time, and who's an urban Aboriginal artist.
uh-huh.
And here's when you look at his market performance, um, I think Kathleen's was about her total cumulative rating at number 17 in the market was about 17, if I remember. Well, Lynn Onus is 94, and he's the third most successful artist.
Mm.
And if you go and, there's, let's have a look here. Very, very successful artist.
Mhm.
If you go to the most successful artists of all time, which is Emily and Worry, it's a very long profile there, and her market performance shows that her cumulative rating is 150, and her highest price at auction was for Earth's Creation, which I sold twice. First in 2007 for $1,056,000, and more recently in 2017 for $2,100,000, 100,000.
And is that painting still within the country? Is it still in Australia?
Yes, that's one owned by one of our biggest mining magnates in Australia. It
Uh-huh.
was included in Emily's retrospective that went to the Venice Biennale. Oh, sorry, that went to toured Japan in 2008. It was shown in the director's exhibition in the Giardini at the Venice Biennale. It's been shown at the Pompidou Centre.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it's not been included in the show that's going to the Tate this year. I don't know why. You'd have to ask the curators why that is, but
But
the next highest price.
are there any rules about protecting the export of such prestigious works as these?
Yeah, there are. There we have what's known as the Movable Cultural Heritage Act in Australia, and it has very strict guidelines. Anything worth more than 250,000 or older than 30 years has to get an export permit. But interestingly enough, the last time we sent Emily and Warry's painting overseas, um, when I put it up for, beg your pardon, when I put it up for sale in 2017, even though that record that was set in 2007, just over a million, was and still was the highest price ever paid for any artwork by any Australian female artist. Um, the Movable Cultural Heritage Committee said it could be bought and sold to someone overseas.
Mm.
Then it sold for $2 million. Um, So you'd have to test that again by sending again putting in an export permit if someone wanted to buy it. But I can't imagine that the current owner will want to sell it at least for some time.
No, but just on the subject of rules and regulations. There was, well, in Europe, there's a uh, a law which is called the droit de suite, which we call here the resale royalty. How does that work with Indigenous artists? Same as everyone?
Yeah, same as everybody. The droit de suite was brought in Australia after some political argument for and against it. Um, I do have my own criticisms of the way the droit de suite was brought in Australia, and while I don't for a minute have any reservations about the heirs of Aboriginal or any other artists benefiting from the resales of their paintings. Um, I think it's given that something like 80 to 90% of all art decreases in value in real terms over time. The only real beneficiaries of resale royalties are the already wealthy estates of the major artists.
Hmm.
That's a great pity. I don't think resale royalties are what they're cracked up to be. But that's a subject for another time. But
Sure.
in the great impetus to bring resale royalties in Australia was the contemporary living standards of Aboriginal people. But the people, the proponents soon discovered that they couldn't bring something in for black people and not for white people as
Hmm.
well. So they brought it in for all Australian artists. It became law in June 2010, so that anything that was sold prior to June 2010 does not have a resale royalty until its first sale after that time. But does that make sense? So
Yeah.
if you bought something in July 2010 and you sell it, you have to pay a resale royalty. So does everyone subsequently. But if you bought it in before June 2010, you don't have to pay a resale royalty, but the next person that buys it does.
I guess there has to be a starting point for
Couldn't be
everything, doesn't
easier.
there? Yeah. Talking about starting points, we're going back to your starting point, which was a little gallery space in Oxford Street in Paddington. But I believe that you've got a new venture, which is going to be also linked to your website and your career. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest um, venture?
Yeah, well, I'm about to launch my own auctions. I started doing auctions. So I did auctions with Menzies. I stopped doing it when the GFC hit in 2008. I wrote my book. I redeveloped my business. I took on a new junior business partner, and she bought the business off me 3 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, it's now called Art 11, formerly Coo-ee Art. And it's a very good gallery, and she's doing a great job there. And she does her own auctions. But I've got a number of other business ventures in Europe that you know about, and I tour exhibitions. I work as an art consultant. So my business is now called Newstead Art Consultancy, and I decided this year that I'm being offered so many artworks, and I can't sell them all by private treaty. So I'm going to do my own auctions, and you can see here the graphic for my new auction platform, which you'll be able to access it on the menu bar up here. So you see artworks, artists, exhibitions, valuations. It'll have auctions, and this is what you'll see, and you'll be able to view the catalogs and bid online. The first auction is going to be held at the end of July, and anybody that's interested, look, you can just go onto my website and get a mailer form. It'll bring up a mailer, just fill it in, and you'll be informed about the auctions. I've got a different view of doing auctions than than the major auction houses, the tier one auction houses that are all trying to do auctions worth two, three, four, $10 million. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in developing new young buyers with far smaller pockets. I'm happy to sell something to a wealthy person, don't get me wrong. But but there are beautiful, beautiful paintings produced by Aboriginal artists across a wide spectrum of styles, um, that from ethnographic looking paintings right through to contemporary and modern looking paintings, figurative and abstracted paintings. They're just wonderful paintings, and you can buy so many of them for under, I don't know, 10, 15,000, and they're lovely things. They may not be the major work from an artist's solo exhibition. They may have been one of the other works, but they all have good provenance, and they're beautiful, and they're affordable, and they're by important artists. You can learn all about the artists on our website and with all the backup material we provide. And so we're committed to doing something, showing these paintings with the respect they're due, rather than having them fall down into the lower tier auctions where
Hmm.
they're treated like another commodity, without any reference to the artists or their stories, their importance, and their
And
significance to the to world art.
but talking about world art, I believe you have a French connection as well.
I do, I do.
Let's have a look,
Well,
can we?
yeah, I can show you
If you
that.
can share that with us, that would be wonderful.
So I've been working with a great friend of mine, Morteza Esmaili, and you can see up here, this is the Chateau de Deux Amants, the Chateau of the Two Lovers, in Normandy in France. It's an hour from Paris. Got over 40 rooms that have been completely renovated, a beautiful restaurant, museum, and it's a wedding venue. It's on a promontory overlooking the Seine, and all of the hinterland of Normandy. It's a stunning place, and so you can see here's the chateau itself, and this is the museum. And in our museum, and we have galleries there. And if I can just go back, let me see. Uh, Here you go, the museum. Here's our museum,
Oh,
and this
it-
is this we've established this, and it's on the verge of opening. The official public opening will be in September, um, uh, but as you can see, it's a uh, this is just the
oh.
museum itself. It's beautiful. And we get private groups coming through and visiting. Um, and we have, when we have big events, people come and see it. And then, let me see now, if I go
So
back,
have you transported all of these
the
works?
accommodation is really lovely. Look at
Have
this.
have you transported all of these works from Australia?
I have, we have. So here you can see that's the Seine down there up on in the distance, and this is where people get married, and the accommodation is really beautiful. And then if I go back to uh, oh well, we've got the legend there, but I won't do that.
Let's look
Um,
at the museum. That looks amazing.
it's fabulous, and the gallery. Here's the gallery. We have two fabulous galleries in the ballrooms of the chateau. There's me showing people the art.
So how do people get there?
It's an hour and a half's drive from Dieppe. It's 20 minutes from Monet's Garden at
Well,
Giverny. It's an hour on the train from Saint-Lazare in Paris to Val de Roy, and we can arrange for people to be picked up there. And here we are. This is my wife and myself and my business partner, Morteza. And that's the Chateau de Deux Amants.
Ooh. This is quite an amazing progression from a little shop in Oxford Street in Paddington.
Yeah, I know. And
But
like we have a lot of touring exhibitions, by the way, Nick, and one of them's been going around Brazil for some time. We've mounted another one that's going to go around France, Switzerland, and Germany. And it's always incredible to be invited to the openings of the exhibitions that we've organized and to meet people at the highest levels of the local art scene and be treated
Mhm.
with such respect and interest. The interest that's shown in Australian Aboriginal art is fantastic. It's the oldest continuous living culture in the world. The Over 60,000 years old, and the contemporary art movement that's developed from it has been it's been the touchstone of my life, and
Sure has.
even 40 years later, I still find it endlessly fascinating, and it's an enormous privilege to work with material like this, and to do it privately. To have it's as you know, because you come here to my home
Mhm.
every now and then. It's insinuated through every room of my home. It's the ultimate salon hang, and I just love it.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's really, your enthusiasm is something that has really sort of contributed to the Australian art market in such a unique kind of way. Adrian, I'd just like to thank you so much for giving us your time. I wish you all of the best with your new venture, both new ventures. I think that they're both fantastic. And I look forward to the next time that I go to France, I'll come and pay you a visit. And I'm sure
Well,
that.
if any of your listeners or watchers are interested, please do send me a line, adrian@newsteadart.com. I'll be delighted to hear from you, and
And
uh, or look up the Chateau de Deux Amants, the Chateau of the Two
yeah,
Lovers.
and I
Uh,
think that
my,
people,
my website. Oh, by the way, Nick,
yeah,
I haven't told you this, but I'll tell you. For 3 years, I was kind of forbidden by contract to put any works of art on my website for
mhm,
sale. So I really built it up as an information site. But within the next month, my wonderful gallery manager and personal assistant, Jasmine, will be launching the stockroom on the site, and there'll be hundreds of beautiful works of art there that people can inquire about.
no,
And,
fantastic. Yeah.
and yeah,
Well, we'll look forward to visiting the website, visiting the chateau, going to your auctions, and just again, thank you so much for your time. We could have talked for hours. It's
it's my
been a
great
pleasure.
pleasure. And hello to everyone in Ireland and in
Thank you.
Europe. Any of you people streaming this on YouTube. Hello to everybody, and thank you for listening. If you got this far, you must have been kind of interested in
Thank
hearing
you.
me, a hokey Australian and mad Antipodean, uh, tell you about the great joy he gets from art.
I'm sure there'll be lots of questions as well. Okay, thank you so much, Adrian. I'm going to stop recording now.
See you, Nick. Hello, mate. Ta-ra.
Bye.